Hello, everyone, and welcome to Womble Bond Dickinson's Energy Outlook 2026, in which we share some key findings from our 5th annual Energy Sector Survey. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Lisa Rushton, co-leader of the U.S. Energy and Natural Resources Sector. Before we dive into our program with introductions, I want to cover a few brief housekeeping items. On the right side of your screen, you'll find an icon for Q&A. Please enter any questions for our presenters in the Q&A feature, and we will do our best to address them at the end of the presentation. For our U.S. attendees, if you've requested CLE credit for today's program, please be sure to stay for the full duration as your attendance is verified via electronic attendance report. Today's program is being recorded. The presentation slides, along with our Global Energy Report, can be accessed from the home screen on this platform and will be circulated in a follow-up email. Next slide. Now, I'd like to introduce my fellow presenters. I'm joined by Chris Towner, leader of our UK Energy and Natural Resources Sector, and Belton Ziegler, who helps lead the US Energy and Natural Resources Sector. Our presentation draws from our survey of industry leaders worldwide and sheds light on some of the challenges and opportunities facing a sector undergoing rapid change. Let's get started with our program. Next slide. Before we get into the findings, it's worth grounding where insights that we are presenting today come from. This research reflects input from 650 senior leaders from across the global energy ecosystem, including C-suite executives, strategic planners, and energy leaders who are directly involved in making or advising on energy investment and delivery decisions. In addition to the survey data, we conducted qualitative interviews with decision makers, and you'll see that perspective reflected in the quotes referenced throughout our report. Those voices help explain not just what is happening, but why. For this program, we'll prioritize the legal implications of those insights, focusing on how counsel can interpret and act on the data, rather than presenting the results in isolation. The goal is not just to share findings, but to translate them into practical, decision-relevant insights for legal teams. To help keep things in context for this presentation, I should point out that the survey results are generally not single market views. A majority of our respondents operate across multiple regions, which means they're navigating overlapping regulatory regimes, permitting standards, and grid connection frameworks. This matters because it helps explain why cross-border regulatory inconsistency shows up so strongly as an issue of concern throughout the findings. When projects span jurisdictions, delay isn't isolated, it's compounded. An issue in one market can stall financing, approvals, or construction across the entire project. It's for this reason, we believe, that 81% of respondents report regulatory inconsistency as a primary factor, causing disruption or delaying milestones. This isn't about unfamiliarity with a local process. It's about managing complexity across systems that weren't designed to work together. As we move into a discussion of insights derived from the survey, it will be helpful to consider the data through that lens. What you're seeing reflects the realities of operating in a global cross-jurisdictional energy system and why legal strategy, sequencing, and coordination have become so central to delivery. I'd like to ask Chris to start us off with some key findings. Chris?
Thanks, Lisa. So you'll see the key findings on the screen. But from the 10,000-foot level, these key issues and findings emerged as the raw signals of coming out from the survey. They represent what business leaders are experiencing on the ground in trying to develop energy projects. What we're seeing is that grid constraints, rising costs, a push for self-generation, a need for technology investment, and a requirement for early engagement all show up here as discrete issues. On their own, clearly, they're each individually important, but individually, they don't yet tell a coherent story. The 6 insights that we'll walk through as part of this presentation are where these findings are connected and interpreted by us. For example, grid constraints and permitting delays combine to show us why production growth is struggling under the current system. Cost escalation and delays create economic barriers and eventually lead to a breaking point for ongoing development. Self-generation and technology investment demonstrate how companies are adapting when physical expansion stalls. And early regulatory and community engagement explains to some extent why some projects succeed while others do not. So as you look at these findings, please don't think of them all as standalone facts. Think of them as individual pieces of evidence. The insights that follow explain how these forces interact and what that means for legal, regulatory, and strategic decision-making in today's energy market. The full report, which we'll be happy to share with you, contains some interesting regional variations. And as Lisa's pointed out, it is very different operating in the different markets we've surveyed. If we take as an example, 42% of UK firms report their energy infrastructure projects have been delayed due to community opposition, and that this is significantly more than the 32% global average. This may be something in the UK that we're very good at. The opposition that we're seeing is not just to new power station development or new oil and gas developments, but it's increasingly to the associated infrastructure. It's the gas networks, the pipeline networks, or the transmission lines that are associated with those projects. And it's also coming out now in relation to the centres of demand, and that's particularly true in relation to data centres. We're seeing a very large expansion of those potentially in the UK market, but we're also seeing already substantial community opposition to them. On the other hand, US companies are amongst the most proactive globally at dispute avoidance, and the focus there is on early engagement with regulators and building strong in-house legal and compliance teams to help tackle this issue. We can move on to the next slide. So if you put a legal lens on the data itself, across the energy sector, the constraints on growth are no longer just technical or financial. They are increasingly legal, regulatory, and systemic. Actually obtaining grid access, getting permits and zoning consents, and actually wondering or establishing how long policy and support mechanisms are going to be in place are shaping what can actually be delivered and when it can be delivered. We're also seeing that there's a clear inflection point. When delay stretches far enough, eventually it breaks the financing assumptions, and then you're into a world where projects are being renegotiated, scaled back, paused, or even in some cases cancelled. And it's at this stage that legal strategy becomes decisive. Large energy users are responding by making infrastructure decisions themselves, while projects most often go off track when legal and regulatory risk is identified too late to manage. The consistent differentiator in the data that we see is that early legal strategy, so jurisdictional assessment, regulatory engagement, and also building contracts that are designed to absorb changes. What we're seeing in practice is actually building into contracts the position of what happens if regulation change, what happens if there's a delay to getting grid access, and how do we adjust that, and how do we give clients a position in that renegotiation rather than leaving them with a cliff edge scenario. And finally, also what we're looking at is technology investment, showing how firms are adapting around constraints. But even there, legal governance still comes up, determining whether optimization delivers value or creates new risks. And of course, there's always the cybersecurity risk. So the message for council is simple. In today's energy market, you don't just support delivery, and there are major challenges to that delivery, but you can help determine what can be delivered and when, and how the obstacles that are going to go up and going to arise can be overcome. So with that, I'll pass over to Belton, who'll lead us through the first of the insights.
Thank you, Chris, and it's a delight to be here with you all. Next slide, please. To frame this slide, we asked leaders a forward-looking question. How does your organization plan to increase energy production capacity in the next 12 months, 1 to 4 years, or beyond? What stands out immediately is that the near term has an emphasis on optimization. Almost half of the respondents plan to implement technology upgrades for efficiency gains within the next 12 months. And a similar pattern appears for retrofitting or upgrading existing facilities. By contrast, regional development, joint ventures, and acquisitions skew much more heavily into the medium-term horizon. That timing difference is important. It reflects how long it takes to secure permits, grid access, and financing for new build projects. Power purchase agreements and asset acquisitions also show a higher considering share, suggesting firms are keeping options open where speed and flexibility matter. The takeaway from this question is that companies are not short on ideas for growth, but in the near term, they are prioritizing strategies that work within existing assets and approvals, while longer cycle options sit further out on the timeline. Next slide, please. The survey leaders were also asked, what barriers are currently limiting your organizations or your clients' ability to bring new energy capacity online. And here we have the top 5 responses. Infrastructure, grid, and pipeline constraints came out on top, cited by 65% of respondents. Very nearly the same percentage of respondents cited permitting and regulatory delays as a key barrier. Another 54% cited uncertainty in policy or market signals. Note that in the UK, 71% cite infrastructure and grid constraints as a barrier, considerably higher than the 61% in the US. The takeaway here is that council has a role in mitigating effects from each of these barriers. Next slide, please. So why is production growth running into friction despite strong demand? The key point is that today's bottlenecks are regulatory in nature rather than technical. Grid connection queues and permitting delays are driven by process design and sequencing, not by lack of equipment or capital. At the same time, timelines are lengthening, not shortening. Multi-agency reviews, litigation risk, and mid-process rule changes mean that projects that once took months now take years. Even where incentives exist, their durability has become a legal risk. Elections, trade disputes, and judicial challenges introduce uncertainty that affects where projects can move forward as planned. The net effect is that capacity exists. Firms tell us they could expand significantly, but it cannot clear the system in the short term. A pivotal question in our survey was, if existing barriers were removed, by how much could your organization or your clients expand energy production relative to current levels? This is what we refer to as the capacity gap. And here we see the results. 42% say that they could expand energy production by between 10 and 25%. And more than a quarter, 26%, say they could expand production capacity by between 26 and 50%. For 9% of the companies, they see the potential to increase their production by over 50%. The average across all respondents and subsectors, including oil and gas, nuclear, and renewables, is 24%. The regional variation of this data is very interesting. For example, 15% of US firms plan to expand production capacity in the next 2 years, the lowest of all regions. Meanwhile, in the UK, the improvement of production capacity expected by UK firms if all barriers are removed is 21%, compared with a global average of 24%. Next slide, please. The capacity gap emerges because regulatory throughput determines what can actually reach the market. Capacity may be technically achievable, but it doesn't move without legal clearance. Reform efforts are underway, but transition risk dominates. New grid and permitting frameworks are largely proposals for future implementation, which means that many projects remain stuck under legacy rules. That delay drives costs, not just inflation, but renegotiation, financing resets, and in some cases, abandonment. Time becomes the primary value destroyer. This is why legal execution increasingly determines outcomes. Contract design, regulatory strategy, and dispute avoidance play a decisive role now in whether projects adapt, stall, or deliver. Next slide, please. In the UK, 55% of companies avoid or exit markets with high legal or regulatory risk. And there's a little more qualitative insight. Justin Mitchell is the head of legal for North America at Nestle, the global producer of renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. Nestle, not Nestle, excuse me there. He sees a strong engagement with the regulator and local regulatory knowledge as critical to the success of his projects. He says the success of our project in California was largely due to our strong joint venture partner. They had experienced staff and knowledge of the local regulatory environment, and it made all the difference. Next slide, please. To understand the consequences of constrained production, we ask leaders this: what impact, if any, have constraints on energy production had on your organization's operations or financial performance? Response is clear. The impacts are broad and material. Cost pressures lead the list, but it quickly cascades into lost profitability, stranded capital, ESG risk, and regulatory exposure. Most importantly, around 1/3 report abandoned projects, which tells us that these constraints are no longer temporary friction. They're in fact forcing permanent strategic decisions. Next slide, please. This slide shows where delay stops being a scheduling problem and becomes an economic one. Across the industry, the average company is losing $325 million a year because new capacity is not coming online on time. These losses concentrate in capital-intensive sectors like nuclear, hydrogen, offshore wind, and oil and gas. These are long cycle projects where the time directly translates into financing, pricing, and execution risk. The takeaway here is simple. Delay is no longer absorbed by the project. At this scale, it breaks the economics. What the data show is that regulatory timelines now routinely exceed the assumptions built into financing, EPC pricing, and offtake arrangements. Permitting delays, grid queue reform, and policy changes and uncertainty don't just push projects out, they fundamentally change their economics. Once incentives are exposed to elections or queue rules that are rewritten midstream, the original business case no longer holds. And that's why delay no longer means a project is delivered later. It means a project must be restructured. At that point, acceleration isn't the solution, restructuring is. Once a project crosses that breaking point, that's where the outcomes diverge. When economics break, contracts stop being static documents and start to function as financial shock absorbers. Change in law clauses, escalation mechanisms, termination rights, and grid risk allocation suddenly matter a great deal. Financing also hinges on legal flexibility, whether the project can reset covenants, reopen pricing, or stage commitments as conditions change. Critically, regulatory strategy becomes determinative. How approvals are sequenced, how transition regimes are managed, and whether disputes are anticipated or allowed to harden all affect survivability. This is where counsel makes a difference. Not after delay occurs, but in designing the projects that can absorb it. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Lisa.
Thank you, Belton. Next slide. To understand how power supply constraints are affecting large energy users, we asked leaders, what impact, if any, have power supply constraints had on your organization's operations or investment decisions? The responses show that this goes well beyond higher energy costs. Many companies report seeing increased reliance on temporary diesel or gas backup generation, delays to facility expansion or construction, and operational inefficiencies. What's most telling is that a meaningful share of respondents are changing operating behaviors altogether, delaying investments, seeking alternative supplies, or shifting operations to regions with more reliable power. The key takeaway is power supply constraints are not just an operational issue. They're driving strategic development and location-level decisions. Next slide. Energy users revealed to us that they expect to meet, on average, 23% of their power needs internally within the next 1 to 3 years. Solar is cited as the top source for self-generated energy, being planned for or implemented by 76% of respondents, followed by natural gas at 41% and wind at 30%, with those three representing the top 3 choices for use in self-generated power. We further expand on alternative options for self-generation in our report. Beyond this, we also noted some interesting regional variations in terms of the response to constrained supply. In particular, it was noted that 39% of U.S. companies are moving operations to areas of the country where energy supply is more abundant and stable, compared to the global average of 31%. Next slide. So let's dig in for a minute more on why large consumers are moving towards self-generation and relocation. Power supply constraints aren't just increasing costs. They're disrupting operations, delaying new facility development, and forcing companies to make strategic decisions about where and how they expand their business. When grid connection take years rather than months, energy becomes a gating issue for business expansion. Self-generation offers something the grid often can't right now, speed, predictability, and control. The relocation statistic reinforces this. When nearly 40% of businesses move operations to where supply is more stable, energy has clearly become a geographic and legal driver, not just an operating expense. Self-generation reduces exposure to grid delays, but it increases legal responsibility. When companies self-generate, they move into a regulatory space traditionally occupied by utilities and developers. That triggers new obligations around planning and permitting, environmental compliance, grid interconnection, emissions, and fuel use. Solar leads because it's modular and often requires a lighter touch from a permitting standpoint. Gas follows because intermittency is less desirous than firm capacity, but each choice brings with it a different regulatory and contractual profile. Relocation adds another layer of legal and business considerations. Tax, employment incentives, and long-term infrastructure commitments often get locked in based on energy availability. At bottom, the grid becomes less predictable. As the grid becomes less predictable, legal strategy has become important to energy security as engineering. Next slide. Our fourth insight brings together what we heard consistently across the survey. Projects don't usually fail because the technology doesn't work. They fail because legal and regulatory risk surfaces too late in the project lifecycle. What follows looks at where disruption shows up first, why it escalates, and how planning and contracting decisions made early on determine whether projects stay on track or slide into dispute. To understand where projects most commonly go off track, we asked our survey recipients a straightforward question. What have been the most significant causes of disruption to your energy projects related to contracts and disputes? The response was clear. Disruption is overwhelmingly contract-driven rather than technical. Contractor and subcontractor disputes top the list, closely followed by cost escalation claims and renegotiations. Force majeure and unforeseen events still play a role, but what is striking is how often disruption escalates beyond the project team into arbitration, cross-jurisdictional litigation, or procurement disputes once commercial assumptions start to break down. The takeaway here is that projects rarely fail because something unexpected happens. They fail because the contract isn't built to absorb what everyone now recognizes as expected volatility. Projects derail at the seams of the contract, where cost, scope, and risk allocation mechanisms stop working under pressure. That brings us to the next question. Where does the pressure originate? This question shifts us upstream to where disruption actually starts for many projects, planning and permitting uncertainty. When we ask our survey recipients what most commonly disrupts projects from a regulatory and approval perspective, the answers were remarkably consistent. The biggest issues are not outright prohibition, they're uncertainty and inconsistency, rules changing mid-project, delays in environmental permitting, and prolonged planning approvals. In the US, roughly half of our respondents reported that conflicting permitting standards across jurisdictions disrupt delivery. In the UK, 45% cite regulatory challenges across jurisdictions as a reason projects delay or go off track, both significantly higher than in other regions. That tells us something important. Regulatory risk today isn't a background condition that can simply be managed around. It actively converts planning risk into delivery risk, particularly for projects that cross state, local, or national boundaries. And this is where the connection between the previous slide becomes critical. When regulatory uncertainty collides with contracts that assume stable rules and predictable approvals, disruption doesn't just slow projects down, it creates conditions for dispute. Put simply, permitting risk doesn't stay in the planning phase, it migrates directly into the contract. Next slide. This is the point at which planning risk becomes a contract stress. Contractor disputes are a good illustration. They're rarely about workmanship alone. More often, they reflect risk that was misallocated, underpriced, or left unresolved at the contracting stage. When conditions shift, whether due to regulation, cost, or timing, those pressure points surface quickly. Cost escalation tells the same story. Many contracts historically were drafted for a more stable environment where change was episodic. Today, change is continuous. Weak or impractical change mechanisms turn commercial pressures into conflict. Force majeure is another area under strain. The boundaries are no longer clear. Events like tariffs, supply chain disruption, or regulatory delay increasingly sit in the gray areas, driving disputes over what is excused, what is compensable, and who ultimately bears the risk. The takeaway is straightforward. Projects fail at the seams of the contract when risk isn't clearly identified, priced, and allocated upfront. In today's environment, contractual resilience is no longer a legal nice to have. It's a core delivery requirement. And when those seams give way, the consequences escalate quickly. Next slide. This is where disruption escalates into formal disputes. When regulatory rules change mid-project or permitting standards differ across jurisdictions, parties are forced back to the contracts to reinterpret obligations, reopen pricing, or renegotiate timelines. The regional data underscores this risk. In both the US and the UK, higher levels of cross-jurisdictional inconsistency correlate with greater disruption from arbitration and litigation once schedules slip and costs rise. What's particularly important is timing. These disputes are no longer end-of-project events. They increasingly arise during permitting or early construction, freezing decision-making, straining stakeholder relationships, and compounding delays. In other words, litigation risk is no longer downstream of delivery failure. It's embedded in the delivery process itself when regulatory uncertainty and rigid contracts collide. I'll leave you with this perspective, which captures the theme running through this insight. And then I'll hand things over to Chris to walk through what organizations are doing in response. The data shows that project disruption is rarely a single event. It's a chain reaction. And the first link is almost always contractual. Disruption becomes dispute when contracts and permits aren't designed to absorb change. Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Lisa. So having looked at some of the problems, should we now look at some of the options and some of the challenges or some of the opportunities that people are taking to manage legal, contractual, and permitting risk? And this chart shows what they're doing, and the pattern itself is very clear. The most widely adopted measures are all front-loaded legal actions. Early engagement with regulators, strengthening internal legal and compliance teams, building relationships with governments, and conducting jurisdictional risk assessments, crucially before investment. By contrast, reactive measures like redesigning projects or introducing new contracting models after problems arise are far less prevalent. What this tells us is that companies are learning, often learning the hard way, that risk mitigation works best before capital is committed and approvals are locked in, when you still have time for some flexibility. This slide explains why the measures you just saw in the data actually matter. What the survey made very clear to us is that projects don't usually fail because of a single shock. They fail when there's a combination of legal and regulatory risks that are identified too late to actually manage. When permitting rules change mid-project, when grid access is repriced or delayed again and again, or when costs escalate unexpectedly, the question becomes whether contracts and approvals were designed to absorb those changes. Where legal teams are brought in early, before capital is committed, firms are able to anticipate jurisdictional risk, sequence approvals more effectively, and avoid surprises that later turn into disputes. The data shows that once projects move into delivery without the early legal foundation, the scope for intervention narrows very quickly, and delay will turn into cost and litigation risk follows. Early legal involvement isn't preventative in theory. It materially changes how projects respond to disruption. This slide is about where legal teams actually create value in practice. First, early legal strategy allows risk to be front-loaded, and measures such as jurisdictional screening, regulatory mapping, stakeholder engagement, and these can all happen before investment decisions are locked in. Secondly, contracts can become tools for resilience rather than rigidity. And there are a number of ways you can do this. It can be through changing law clauses, escalation mechanics, and clear allocation of grid and permitting risk, allowing projects to adapt instead of stalling. And fundamentally, as we mentioned earlier as well, if when you come to that crunch point, they're also lining up a position for your client for a renegotiation to actually allow the contract to have recognized that there are going to be changes and what is going to be their position on those changes. Thirdly, financing outcomes increasingly depend on legal flexibility. Lenders and investors are looking for structures that can survive regulatory transition and extended timelines. Lenders themselves know the project's going to change during development. What are you going to bring to the table to address those risks? And finally, strong dispute mitigation frameworks reduce the likelihood that disruption freezes delivery altogether, how to avoid the project stalling completely, losing the supply chain, etc. Fundamentally, when legal strategy is embedded early, projects can adapt. When it arrives late, projects tend to litigate. If we could move on to the next slide. And then on to the sixth insight. So this is our final insight, and it reflects how firms are adapting when expansion does actually stall. And fundamentally, this comes down to tech investment. And we know that tech investment, as you see on the slide, is set to rise by approximately 16% in 2026. But one of the interesting questions is why? This isn't just discretionary innovation spend. It's a response to the constrained build-out of the physical network and the physical environment that projects are facing. So when grid access, permitting, or financing delay physical expansion, what we're seeing is companies turning to technology to unlock capacity that exists within their existing assets. We're seeing optimization, digitalization, and performance upgrades, and that these are simply faster and more predictable than new construction. The key insight here is that technology has become actually the fastest path to increasing capacity, given the constraints in the system. And it allows firms to improve throughput without reopening the regulatory and cost risks that come with new builds. What's changed since last year is not just the level of tech investment, it's the reason for it. 2/3 of companies are now already investing in AI for operational efficiency, up from less than half last year. That acceleration reflects necessity, not experimentation. When firms are asked where they are prioritizing technology spend to increase supply or performance, the answers are always very pragmatic. They're optimizing operations with AI, they're upgrading existing infrastructure, and they're using digital twins or predictive maintenance to help avoid downtime. These aren't growth bets, they're resilience and throughput strategies. They allow companies to extract more capacity from the assets they already own without reopening the permitting, grid connection, or financing risks that exist. Also, interestingly, in the US, 61%, and in Europe, 63% of energy companies are prioritizing emissions monitoring technology while also taking measures to expand production through innovation. In the UK, that figure is only 51%, and it's one of the things we'll certainly be looking into. The takeaway here is that tech has become the fastest path to capacity where physical expansion is delayed or is uneconomic, and that shift is happening right now. This slide is the logical endpoint of the story we've been telling so far. What we've seen is that production growth is colliding with grid bottlenecks, permitting delays, rising costs, supply chain issues. What this data shows is how companies are responding when physical expansion simply cannot be fast enough. Rather than waiting years for new interconnections or approvals, firms are increasingly turning inward, using tech to unlock throughput and reliability from assets they already control. The increase in tech investment we're seeing isn't about digital transformation in the abstract. It's a purely pragmatic response to the constraints that exist in the systems. Automation bypasses many of the regulatory choke points that we've been touching on. There is no new greenfield permitting, there is no grid queue position risk, and you get faster payback than new build. What's important for lawyers and for business leaders is that this doesn't eliminate risk, it simply shifts the type of risk and where it's located. Instead of permitting and planning risk on the front end, companies now face governance, data integrity, and accountability risks embedded in operations. AI-driven optimization, digital twins, and automated demand management all raise questions about oversight, liability, compliance, and vendor responsibility. And then there are also very serious cybersecurity issues to be considered as well. The insight here is it's not simply that firms are spending more on tech, it's that optimization has increasingly become a default growth strategy because of the systemic failures in the system that are blocking expansion and leading to the challenge of demand outstripping supply. What this means is now that legal risk sometimes sits inside operations, not just in relation to approvals. When build-out slows, optimization accelerates, and council increasingly determines whether that transition is actually resilient or adds additional risks. If you could move on, thank you. And on to the next slide. So if there's one takeaway from this discussion, it's this. The constraint on energy growth today is not ambition, capital, or technology. It's execution and delivery of projects. We've seen that demand is accelerating, but the physical systems and the regulatory systems we have that deliver capacity can't keep pace. Grid access, permitting timelines, and regulatory uncertainty are introducing delay, and it's delay that is highly corrosive to value. In response, we're seeing that companies aren't standing still. They're optimizing existing assets, they are restructuring projects, they are renegotiating contracts, and they are deploying tech to work around the bottlenecks. But what is critical for this audience is where the risk now sits. It's moved away from internal approvals and into legal design. What companies increasingly need is contracts that can absorb change. They have governance frameworks that can support automation. They have regulatory strategies that assume the rules of the game will shift mid-project. That's why legal teams are involved earlier, more frequently, and more strategically than ever before. It should be a very interesting time. In today's energy market, the most constrained resource isn't capital and it's not technology. It's getting decisions made early enough and getting input into those decisions to matter. So in terms of the way forward, where are we going? The 5 points on this slide are not generic recommendations. They're directly grounded in what the surveys told us about what is actually going on in today's energy market on the ground. First, there is collaborative planning with regulators and planning authorities. And this stands out because our data shows that bottlenecks are systemic, not technical. Early and sustained engagement is one of the few levers firms have to reduce delay before it becomes an economic breaking point. Second, building agile systems for policy and regulatory change reflects the reality that delay and uncertainty, not demand, are now driving cost escalation. There is going to be the demand for the energy there in the future. What we need to do is meet it and work out how we're going to achieve that. Projects that assume the rules will change during delivery of the project, during the construction phase and during the operation phase, and are designed to adapt, are far more likely to survive. Third, designing for investment is a response to the cost and financing pressures that we see across the sector. As timelines stretch and capital costs rise, projects that are investable, flexible, and transparently structured are the ones that keep and retain funding. Fourthly, structuring projects for effective dispute mitigation follows directly from where projects go off track. The survey shown that disruption most often becomes litigation, where contracts cannot absorb change. Getting that right up front reduces both delay and the corrosion of value. And finally, leveraging AI while keeping governance robust and cybersecurity robust reflects how firms are adapting when expansion is constrained. Tech is now a workaround for a blocked physical build-out, but the legal and governance frameworks around it determines whether that optimization is going to create value or lead to additional risks for companies and clients. Taken together, these aren't just best practices. They are practical ways that legal teams can influence outcomes in a bottleneck, capital-intensive energy system such as we see today. So finally, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today, and we hope this presentation has been beneficial to you. As Lisa mentioned, you can access our Global Energy Report and presentation deck on the homepage of the platform. We will also circulate a link to the on-demand recording and share a brief survey in which we value your feedback. As always, if you'd like to discuss any of the findings in more detail, please do reach out to Lisa Belton or to myself. I'd also very much like to thank the WBD team that have been involved in developing the survey and today's presentation. It's been a fantastic effort by all of you. And finally, I'd just like to reiterate thanks again to all of you for attending and for your time today.
And we do have a few questions that have come in, so we have some time to actually address those. I will go ahead and read those, and we would ask our speakers to pick up the one most relevant to you. Paul has asked 3 questions. First, which comes first, chicken or egg? Do utilities first build new generation and infrastructure, i.e. build it out and they will come, or do data centers build out hoping electricity will be there? There is a significant timing asymmetry between new generation, new gen, and AI.
I can say something about that. What we're seeing is utilities telling their data center customers We'll sign you up for power, but we won't guarantee it's uninterruptible until we've had a chance to build a specific generating unit that's going to be required to meet this additional load. And data centers really can't take the risk of building without a clear path to electric service. So this is a way to balance the structure. And it seems to be a fairly well received approach. But it does mean that most data centers will not have a build out for 5 years or so. But it takes time to build a data center. So there's some coordination, if you will, between those two cycles.
I'll do one overlay to that, Belton. Also, we're also seeing quite a number of data centers with which we're working actually doing self-generation themselves. They're building, the units. We're seeing quite a bit of gas units that are being built, within the fence line to supply all of the energy needs for the data center, with the thought that maybe down the road they'll tap into the grid. But for now, they're actually moving forward and just self-sustaining.
Yeah, that sounds very much like the position in the UK, where traditionally, the project has had to be there and the demand has had to be there for the utility to build out. We do have a number of projects now where the networks are being developed in advance demand, so we are starting to move in that direction. But as Lisa mentioned, a number of people are very much looking at on-site generation to cover the period until a grid connection can be achieved, and then to act as backup in case the grid goes down to give the data center that 24/7 operation and resilience.
I think while this program's been going on, the U.S. EPA has withdrawn the greenhouse gas rule, which required all coal plants in the United States basically to be retired by 2032. The withdrawal of that rule underscores something we've been saying here, which is the risks in both directions of not knowing what regulation is going to be is dramatic. And in the United States, you have people who've invested significantly, utilities and others, in renewable resources, understanding that they were against a baseline of a highly limited fossil generation ability for the country. That puts them out of step with people who maybe haven't invested as much. And it also means that there's the possibility that you can use existing coal plants to bridge that gap for data center, between when the data center wants to start and when the capacity to serve it is going to be available. Coal plants typically do not run very often in the United States. The economics good compared to the other options. So it's really a reserve capacity that they represent in many cases. And so that would be the structure that would allow you to keep those plants nominally online, but use them to bridge the gap for data centers.
Thank you all. We have another good question here that may be best directed to you, Chris, and that is DNO grid install businesses in the UK are still using current planning applications to determine the future demand curve. It needs detailed qualitative data from industry to understand the 3 to 5 and 10-year plans. Any thoughts or insights you would add to that comment here from Steve Ross?
It sounds like a very good comment about how to create a more informed environment in which to actually make the decisions we need to make. So it sounds like it's a very good comment, Steve, and one that I might explore outside of this conversation with you as to how best we could get that into the process to make that sure that is adopted as an approach. Fundamentally, as I'm sure you know, Steve, the whole grid queue arrangements in the UK in GB at least, are facing a number of challenges right now and going through a reform process. And that is delaying projects considerably. But clearly, once we get through this stage of the process, what comes next and how to actually deliver that is going to be key. And so it sounds like that's a very good suggestion, as demand does seem to be ticking up in the UK, and with increased electrification of heat and transport, we imagine it is only going to continue rising. So yes, if Steve could be given my details, Kay, then I'd be very happy to help take that forward.
And we have 2 other questions. One came earlier in the presentation that maybe one of you could just provide additional insight on. Question or thought from Paul. I thought transformer deliveries were a major pain point. Can anyone speak to that?
I can certainly take it from a UK perspective, as most of the transformers that the UK needs, I believe, are produced in South Korea. And informally, we are aware that the order books for the Koreans are full for approximately the next 3 to 4 years. And so therefore, actually advancing any projects in the light of that supply chain bottleneck is very much a challenge. But also having enough consistent demand to develop, our own transformer plant would, considering taking an extremely long length of time, given some the same challenges around permitting, etc., would apply. So it is a challenge for us. And just going back to my previous answer, partially it's going to be interesting to see if the new shakedown of the queue in the UK does have any impact on that and how many transformers we actually need.
I would mention that in the survey, we ask about technology being available. And technology can mean either the equipment or the actual intellectual property. I think we were thinking more in terms of intellectual property. But yes, there's no question that transformers are a big issue, as are switchgear and turbines if you're looking at a gas project. But we see the turbine industry, for example, is investing finally in increasing their capacity. They did that in the last cycle and ended up with more capacity than they needed. So they were reluctant to invest this time. But Mitsubishi, which builds gas turbines just over the border from South Carolina and Savannah, has committed to double its production. And there seems to be some understanding now that the supply chain constraints aren't going away and that smart firms are going to be investing to meet the demand that others can't.
Thank you. We have one final question. What is the basis of annual company losses? Is there enough context there to provide some insights?
I'm not sure I have that context, Kate.
I don't
Just on
either.
the basis of we may have to come back to that question. I think also in the sense of how those losses were built up and what underlies that figure. Without being rude, just because I'm a lawyer, I may not be the best person to talk about the numbers in that sense. Unless anybody else wants to take it, I suggest we come back to that question.
Yes, I think the way, as I understand, the survey simply asks customers, asks respondents to report the level of losses based on delayed or canceled projects, and how they decided what number to put there. I don't know that we know, but that's what they report, and we're passing that information along. I got one other insight that may be worth talking about, and that's the question of how do you develop the strongest relationship possible within the regulatory environment where you're planning to invest. And what I've seen with a number of my clients is they start with the legislative branch. And in my context, I've had 2 major projects that have been, before the projects were fully baked, before they were really announced, specific legislation was proposed, and this is in the United States and state government, to clear the way for those projects. And obviously the projects still have to go through the standard regulatory process. But in one case, the legislature told the regulators that you have 6 months to issue a permit or it's considered issued without action. And you must consult with the applicant and do everything you can to clear the way so that they get a permit. And if a permit is denied, it's appealable immediately after the process within the agency to the state Supreme Court, which has to accelerate the hearing of it. All that put together in an attempt to mitigate regulatory delays. And this applies to across the board. It's not just this one project. The promoters of this project saw the risk that they would have as far as delay. And so they went and handled it directly by changing the law. The beauty of changing the law is that it's not something that can be undone by administrative fiat. There's a real question in the United States of how do you run an electric utility when one president imposes one set of rules, another president withdraws them, another president comes in and imposes different rules, and then the next president, as we've done today, withdraws them. It is very difficult to build a system that is based on assets with lives between 40 and 80 years, based on the political winds on a 4-year cycle. The only answer is to have these rules established by legislative act. It just takes a lot longer, a lot more stability if you're dealing with the statute than you're dealing with an executive order. So we'll see how that plays out. The U.S. Supreme Court's very keen on the idea that there's too much being done with executive orders. So we'll see what happens there.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting, sorry, that is also an option in the UK, but one that is very rarely taken. You probably know that historically a lot of our railways and canal infrastructure was developed on that kind of basis, but in the last 10 years, I think it's been used once in relation to a major sewage project, for example. But we are sometimes finding that, when people have come to us and said, well, it takes 7 years to consent a new transmission electricity line and 3 years to then build it, can we get rid of that 7 years via the route you've just mentioned? Given the scale of local opposition that sometimes has been mentioned that we see in the UK, not all members of parliament are necessarily keen on taking that approach and effectively overriding the public opposition by using an act of parliament. But it's an interesting option.
You have to have a legislature that really understands and recognizes the importance of the problem. And in the case that I am referring to, there was a clear reliability issue if new generation wasn't added because of growth there. And it was possible for the project proponents to educate the legislators over the course of many, many months before the legislation saw the light of day. It is a slow process at the front end, but it pays huge benefits to the back end.
We have one final question. I think it's a good one, and this might be a nice ending point. So would ask our panelists to consider your thoughts on this, and then maybe leave the audience with any final insights, actionable insights as we look at the way forward. And so the question is, the survey pointed to solar as the top area of energy investment in the coming years. Offshore wind used to cause the most excitement. Based on WOMBL's leading energy practice globally, what are the panelists' views about the future of offshore wind?
I'll hit this first, and then Chris, if you want to go. I would say solar is attracting the most near-term investment momentum right now, but that does not mean offshore wind is over. It means offshore wind market is maybe resetting, particularly here in the U.S. We have an administration that's not favoring it, but this administration there will be a new administration coming in the future. So it's not disappearing. I think it's just having a little bit of a reset right now. Chris, what's your perspective in the UK?
Yeah, I very much support that. It's always fun being in the UK and then talking about solar and relying on that for the future. So clearly in the UK, we do actually, and particularly in northern Scotland, we have far more wind than we do solar actually, and it's more useful in terms of times of peak demand, which for us is winter evenings. And so we are seeing actually offshore wind being a very, very crucial part of the energy mix in the UK going forward, but it is part of the mix. And so it will partially depend on the scale of the resources that you have in each jurisdiction and the attractiveness of the offshore wind. We are here doing our first floating offshore wind, and again, that could be a game changer in terms of the next generation of offshore wind that will be developed, and it should open up more areas to the offshore wind developers. So it's still, and just in a pure practical terms, we are still seeing an awful lot of development on a day-to-day basis in relation to offshore wind. We think that will continue. So yes, so in terms of Northwest Europe in particular, I would say yes, the North Sea will continue to be a very active market for offshore wind for the next 10 to 20 years at least.
And I will just add, here in the US, there was a legal victory for offshore wind recently. So hopefully some of the projects that have been permitted that stalled for a bit will start moving again.
Thank you. Before we close, we have a few minutes. Would ask each panelist, as we look at the way forward and with the goal of providing actionable insights from your vantage point in your practice, leave the audience with one insight, whether it be on the regulatory front, technology investment or otherwise that you might leave them with for the energy future. Lisa, let's start with you.
I would say there's a lot of opportunity right now in the short term to take advantage of technology and all the technologies offering with regard to optimization of operations and figuring out, how best to take advantage of what you currently have while planning takes place and while you're figuring out the next step. So I strongly recommend folks, if they haven't already, to fully embrace AI and technology and how it can optimize your current operations. Chris, Belton?
Yeah, that's fine. I would probably go on the engagement front in the sense of, it was a message throughout the presentation was, engage with regulators because they don't necessarily have the solutions at all. They don't necessarily have the experience that you have, and they're not necessarily seeing all of the problems that you're seeing. And so it is early engagement on a practical level to work with them to help address the problems that there are in the system and help solve those systems. Because without being rude, they're probably not going to come up with perfect answers on their own without any engagement from the industry. So I would very much stress that engaging with them to help solve a collective problem would be the mentality to adopt.
From my perspective, the biggest change that's happened in the last several years is that electricity has gone, and that's the primary area in which I work, has gone from a sleepy little market that grew very, very slowly to one which is not only expanding, the need is expanding beyond the ability of the systems to put new capacity online, but the need has been determined to be a matter of real national importance in terms of national security, and the idea that AI needs to be dominated by players who are committed to a more open approach and so on. And so you're seeing a particular shift in the understanding of how regulators ought to respond to utility or energy permitting, not as necessarily a unpleasant evil that has to be put up with, but as something that's vital for the welfare and future of the areas we serve. And that means that the regulatory process is more open to persuasion, more open to early intervention, more open to people who go in and say, this is why this project is needed. And I think it's a very optimistic time as a result of that.
Thank you all. Thank you, speakers, and thank you to our attendees. As Chris noted earlier, you can access a copy of our Global Energy Report, as well as the presentation deck on the homepage of this platform. And we will circulate a link to the on-demand recording, as well as a brief survey. We would greatly value your feedback and opportunity to continue the conversation and engage with you further. Thank you again for attending today.